Hello, everyone. This is Arman from Coyotiv, and today we're having a special event. We have an amazing guest with us, Kyle Simpson, the man himself. Hi, Kyle. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Thanks for having me, Armin.
This is this is a great moment for me as well. I was really looking forward to this moment for maybe months now. It was always a dream to have you here on stream with us. And today we have an amazing topic: learning software engineering and the future of learning software engineering, and maybe also teaching software engineering, because times are changing right now. But I'm just too excited. Before we jump into that, I guess Kyle Simpson doesn't really need any introduction, but like I guess everyone on stream already knows him, especially maybe through the book series You Don't Know JavaScript, which was like prolific to say the least. I think it shaped how people teach JavaScript as well. I remember when you first came up with the book, it was like at a very specific moment where the industry like was almost taking a wrong path, maybe like getting too confusing and too distracted, too much focused on the wrong parts, wrong aspects of teaching JavaScript. And it was really something that I could recommend my students to learn JavaScript. And then you didn't stop there. I guess like you have, how many books do you have? 12, 11?
Yeah, so there was the first edition turned out to be 6 books. It was originally going to be 3 short 50-page books. It turned into 6 books that span a little over 1,100 pages because it turns out there was a lot more that I didn't know about JavaScript, so there was a lot more to say. And then I did a second edition, and I have completed, or draft completed anyway, 2 published and 2 draft complete. So 4 books of the second edition. I've also written the Functional Light JavaScript book, and I was an author on the HTML5 cookbook. So I guess that's 12 in total.
Yeah, that's crazy. And I guess like this stems from the love of humans and like making sure that they have the best practices, they know like the best approach to learn a language. What motivates you there? Because you
Yeah,
also
so
like you define yourself as a human centric technologist, which is something I can only agree with. You have a lot of talks, a lot of trainings. I don't know how many trainings out there on front end masters, for example.
yeah, I would say like so going back to how you were kind of setting up the time, the context where those books, where the first edition was first proposed and written. So it is important to understand the context, and it is both exciting and a little bit sad, I guess, to me, or whatever, to think that the majority of people listening may not have even been software engineers at that time, because we're going back to 2011, 2012, so well over a decade now. And some people don't really remember the context that was happening. I've been in the industry now for well over 20 years, 25 years now. And so I do have some more context, and I have seen a lot of these cyclical patterns, but it is important to understand some of the context of what was happening. So in late 2008, one of the most pivotal books in all of JavaScript's history, JavaScript: The Good Parts by Doug Crockford, kind of first became popular.
Yeah.
And even to this day, there are still many people who own that book so that that book can be sitting on the shelf at their office, right? Whether they've even read it in the last decade, it's a book to own. It's a book to have physically on the shelf, because it was really the turning point. It was an inflection point for the language. Prior to that time, JavaScript had been around. We'd had the advent of JavaScript, some of the early JavaScript libraries like jQuery and Dojo and YUI and a few other MooTools, a few of those others. Those had come out in the 2005 to 2008 timeframe. And so people were definitely using a lot of JavaScript. But I think unfortunately, what was happening with a lot of those libraries is that was contributing to JavaScript being seen as a problem that needed to be papered over, right? And even to this day, people still think of JavaScript as being at fault for all of the cross-browser differences that people experience. There certainly was some truth to that back in the day. In the early 2000s, we saw a lot of divergence between, Mozilla and Safari browsers versus IE, because IE had their own implementation that they called JScript, and it was mostly the same but not the same, and there were some divergences, but the vast majority of the differences are in the web platform APIs.
Yeah.
They're not the JavaScript language. And nowadays there is no other implementation of JavaScript. I mean, there are multiple engines, but we don't have
There are
like
some
a
standards, right?
competing JScript anymore like we did back then. And so those libraries were seen as fixing a problem with the language. And that, I think, is that combined with the book and the framing of the book and the way that people took the good parts book, it was basically saying JavaScript has this problem and there's only one way, there's only a few ways to fix it, right? And
Mhm.
one of the major messages that came out was a lot of JavaScript is not something that you should be interacting with. You should be using these higher level libraries that abstract away the difficulties, and you should be really only learning a subset that this one guy said was the good parts of the language, and really all the rest of it is kind of garbage. That was the context in 2008, and it carried into 2009 and 10 and 11. And I was increasingly frustrated with that narrative of the language. But yet you do have to give credit that were it not for those libraries and for the good parts book, JavaScript might actually have fallen by the wayside, and what would have taken its place would have been one of the many different suitors that wanted to create a vendor-centric version of the web,
Right.
whether that was Flash, whether it was Silverlight, whether it was any Java, any of a number of other things, that these technologies were waiting in the wings, wanting to supplant the web and wanting to respond to this idea that the web could not survive and thrive if all it was just JavaScript and the other technologies like CSS and HTML. And I think the revival that happened and the interest that happened in JavaScript is a good that comes out of what is otherwise a somewhat frustrating narrative that JavaScript has all these problems, because it gave people this hope, like, oh, I hate JavaScript so much, but hey, this book and these libraries, they've all said that there is this enlightened way of doing JavaScript that we I think those are responsible for why I have a job today and why most of us have a job. They're the reason why JavaScript stuck, why it became cemented at the center of the web, and I don't think it's going to
Yeah.
go anywhere anytime soon. And so, I was frustrated by that. And the purpose of the books was really to say, I think that message and that narrative, not only is it something that I just personally disagreed with because I didn't find JavaScript to be as flawed as the claims were saying, but I also felt that message was condescending to people,
Yeah.
myself included, because that message was basically saying, this is too hard for you to do, so don't even worry about it. Let the experts figure out the parts that you should learn and do, and use what they build and read what they write, and don't worry about the rest of it. And I felt that was inherently a condescending and pessimistic view of the technology. And so the You Don't Know JS books, in large part, were my response to that context. They were my response to say, I do believe in the inherent capability of every single person who picks up a keyboard and says, I'm going to write some code. I
Yeah.
believe in the infinite capacity of people. And I do believe that the technology that we have at the center of the web has all of the capacity to do what people need it and want it to do. And I felt like JavaScript was really getting a bad end of that stick, if you will. So the You Don't Know JS books were to say, let's be the opposite message to that, which is not to say let's focus on the bad parts, but rather let's focus on all the parts. Let's focus on actually understanding the full breadth of the technology toolbox we have in front of us, learn all the parts of it, learn the places where it is useful to use and the places where we should
Yeah.
avoid it. Because I believe people are both capable of that and deserve to be treated like adults in that way. And that really was the heart of why I wanted to write that book series.
I think it made JavaScript accessible, let's say. Up until that point, like most books were maybe like too academic and not really teaching it to total beginners, maybe. Like very much like written like college books that teach you C++. And that was like the first thing I felt when I read You Don't Know JavaScript series. Like, this is approachable in a human tone. It is something that beginners can understand and reason about, because it's not just dumping syntax on you, but rather like talking about why these things are happening the way they are.
I tried to write with, and I still try to do this. I tried to write with my voice, my like literally. If I was going to sit down with you and explain something, I would say it in much the same way as what I put down on the paper in those books,
Yep.
and that works for some. And in fact, for many, I'm blessed that there are so many people that have found the books to be useful. Others, it didn't work so much for, and that's okay. We're a big tent here, and I'm
Yeah.
fine that there is a whole lot of other thoughts and ways of doing it, and whatever way works for you is great. But I did try to, I wouldn't say that I set out to try to create a beginner book. The first book in the series was actually written later, well into the series, because I was getting feedback that people thought that I started at 60 miles an hour, and they're like, hey, we didn't get any acceleration. So I did go back and write a book to kind of create the bridge, but it was never really designed to be either an intro book or an advanced book. It was designed to be a book as if we were on a journey together, discovering,
Yep.
asking questions, and then answering them, because that's literally what I did. As I asked questions, and then I wrote down what I found out about those, to try to answer those questions. So I hope that voice is still coming through even all these years later, because it's the same spirit that I'd have if somebody found me at a conference and they had a question. I would talk to you exactly in the same way as I have written those books.
So Coyotiv has a school. I guess like we skipped that part entirely. Coyotiv has a school in Berlin, Germany. We teach software engineering and we work with career changers, which is really an amazing niche because there are professionals in other professions and they're moving over to software engineering. And we're not only using your books as teaching material at the school, because I believe they're like amazing, the best resources that you can find online, maybe with Eloquent JavaScript. I also love that book. And coupled with that, I think like this is the perfect duo for teaching JavaScript. But we also are having You Don't Know JavaScript Yet, the second edition of the series in our curriculum. And I guess it's fair to say here that I was very much excited when I saw that you had a Kickstarter about that series. And I was like, yes, now this is a great opportunity for us to back Kyle and his work and maybe like give back some of like the amazing value that he created for the industry. And I was very happy to see the progress on that book. Maybe a more refined taste that you have there as well.
I
How
think,
do you compare it to the first series?
yeah, I would definitely say for the books that exist in the second edition series, certainly the first two that were fully published, the books 3 and 4 that are basically draft complete, there are probably some to-dos and refinements that I could do in the future, but I've said the lion's share of what I was going to say about those topics in books 3 and 4.
Yep.
And they do, while the titles match to the first edition, they are complete rewrites. Those 4 books in the second edition are complete ground up rewrites. Not a single bit of it is the same as what I said in the previous book. That was not my intention, actually. My intention for the second edition was, let me just do a few revisions and try to get this out quickly. But again, it turns out that in the 6 to 8 years from the first edition to the second edition, I learned an awful lot more about JavaScript, and JavaScript itself changed a lot, and the community changed, and that required a different lens to approach
Yeah.
the language. Not a different mission. It's still exactly the same mission, but a different lens, which is reflective in, very low level details. Like, for example, in the first edition, one thing that some people loved and a lot of people really hated was that I did a lot of literal foobar examples, because and that was on purpose, by the way. I did that because a lot of times I've found in my teaching that if you present a domain, a context for some code, if the person listening has some prior assumptions about that domain, if they've done it before, if they've seen it before, they can get tripped up on it. They can ask
Yeah.
a whole lot of other questions about the domain that aren't about the thing that you're looking for. So it creates more opportunity for the cognitive overload. And I'm a big proponent of being very careful about not overloading people. And so I deliberately chose non-domain examples, but that was controversial, and probably one of the biggest sets of criticism of the books was that people didn't like all of the esoteric foobar stuff. So the second edition went the complete opposite, and I chose, they're simple domains, but I chose real non-foobar examples for all the code. So there were things that I changed about my teaching technique and about my explanation technique. I'd spent a lot more time with JavaScript, and there were places where my opinions had evolved. Certainly the language had shifted, and so there were things that I de-emphasized in the first edition, and they had to become first-class citizens in the second edition, or the books would have been, largely irrelevant, right? I'm well known as not being a big fan of the class keyword. But if I wrote a book about classes and I didn't have front and center the class keyword, that book would not be particularly relevant in today's JavaScript. So I had to do it, and I had to walk a careful line of, here's how this works, here's what I think you should do with it. But I've always done that. I've always said, here's something about JavaScript that you should learn, and here's then my interpretation of what you should do with it. And so I presented places there where prior I would have, I literally left the class keyword for an appendix in the first edition. It was front and center. It got its own couple of chapters, and I talked about what I think its strengths and its weaknesses are. And if you were going to do X, then you would do it this way. And so that is very different. And it doesn't really represent an opinion shift in that respect, but certainly a response to the new context that we're in. We're in a different context now than, or even a few years ago, we're in a different context than we were when I wrote the first edition. There were also things that I literally changed my opinion on, and I felt they needed to have more coverage. I'm still not a huge fan of the arrow function, but there are places where I use it now, and in the past, I was very much against the arrow function.
Yes.
I still use it on a very limited basis, but my opinions have shifted. Some opinions flipped like that, and some opinions even deepened. My opinion on coercion and on the use of double equals. In the first edition, I kind of, presented both sides and whatever. And in the second edition, I was like, no, it's all double equals. And,
Yes.
I'm unabashedly unashamed that I believe that. So, there were shifts in myself and in the community, and it reflected itself in the rewrites of those books.
It's amazing. I also have very strong opinions when it comes to JavaScript, and that double equals thing. I don't know how many times I died on that hill fighting the battle. Like, I really, really, really don't understand why you would ever use triple equals. Like, there are two places I think that it would be useful if you're checking for undefined, and that's about it. Everywhere else, I think coercion is what you actually want, because this is a language that is a tool that helps you be productive. And I personally like coercion. So
For the benefit of the viewers, let me give a very brief summary of the argument in favor, from my perspective, the argument in favor of defaulting to double equals. So number one, I am a big proponent, and that was a big part of book 4 of the second edition. I'm a big proponent of what I call type aware coding. I do not love the way that TypeScript goes about getting you to type awareness, but I do think that type awareness is important, at least to an extent. I'm not a big, arguing in favor of don't know your types, everything's dynamic, everything's crazy, and that's not me. So I do think that type awareness is important, and I think there are ways to go about that in JavaScript's system. And one of those is to understand the difference, for example, between the double equal and the triple equal. And so the real difference between those two is that if you do already, actually the non-difference, the way that they are the same is that if the values that you are comparing, if you know what they are and they are the same, meaning you know that it's always going to be 2 strings, or you know that it's always going to be 2 numbers or whatever. If that is true, and I would say it should be true, especially if you're using something like TypeScript, you should know the types and you should know what they are going to be, and they should be the same most of the time. If that's true, the double equals and the triple equals literally do exactly the same thing.
yes,
The spec says it, the engines do it. They do exactly the same thing. Why type an extra character for no reason? I'm not talking about like save the character. I'm literally, I don't care whether you type the character or not, but like, why have an extra character there and an extra signal there that isn't necessary?
it's confusing, right?
I think, but let me finish. I just want to make sure so everybody hears it at least once from me. You heard it directly from the horse's mouth. Why I believe this, because a lot of people are probably yelling at the screen right now, like how dare he? So if they're the same, and I think in most cases they should be, then the double equals is correct. It is the shorter one that does the same thing. If the types are different, meaning I do know what my types are, and it may or may not be the case that I've got a string that I'm comparing to a number. You have 2 rational choices. One is to allow JavaScript's coercion system to do its comparison, to understand how that works and say, I know how strings coerce to numbers and how they compare, whatever. I'm not at all advocating that you should have like an exotic object with its value of being compared to a Boolean or anything like that. But like, if you have a string and a number, or a null and an undefined or whatever, there are well-defined and easy to learn coercion rules. And I think even the most junior of your team can learn them, especially if they're learning all the TypeScript and React stuff that you throw at them these days. They can learn the basic type system. And so you have the choice. Do I want to allow the double equals to do that work? Or do I want to explicitly cast one of the two to the other, meaning take my string and make it a number, or number make it a string, or whatever? Or really the only third option is to do, it's kind of the bailout, is basically to do two comparisons. So you could say like x triple equal 3 or x triple equal string 3, right? Those are really the only rational choices, because anything else, the comparison would fail. I mean, the conditional would fail. So you have those choices. And when you compare both the performance and the coding style of them, JavaScript's coercion system is better at that job than our code will ever be. It just is. And it's going to do it faster, and it's going to do it more effectively if you know what you're doing. And I think people can know what they're doing. So again, in that case, when you know the types and they can be different, and there's a rational subset that applies to, like I said, the double equals is better. If you do not know the types, so this is the third part of this argument. If you don't know the types, or you can't predict the types, that's ostensibly what the triple equals is supposed to be protecting us, right? Like it's our fail safe, because we don't know the types. But I think we should take a step back and admit that if, especially in modern JavaScript, if you are making a comparison, an if statement or some other kind of comparison, and you have absolutely no idea what the types could be a number, could be a Boolean, could be an object, could be a function, That's just badly written code. That's just poor code. And it wouldn't pass in any TypeScript project anyway. So there's no place in your TypeScript project where you're likely to have a comparison that absurd. And most people using TypeScript these days, whether I like it or not, it's definitely the de facto standard these days. So I really think that if you're in one of those cases, that's going to be a rarer exception case rather than the standard for your comparisons. And it should be a clue to you that to protect yourself, you have to use the triple equals. In other words, that's your last case scenario. If you can't refactor the code to make it so that you know what the types are, if you can't make it work with double equals, and you have to use triple equals, then that should be like a glowing neon sign. And in fact, you should put a code comment there that says, I'm sorry I had to use the triple equals because I don't know what the types are and I don't have time to change those. That's what that's for. The triple equals should be signaling, I don't know the types and I need some extra help to protect me. But it should be a to-do item to fix later, because we really should know what our types are. We should not have ourselves in such a bad situation that we have to be protected by the strict equality of triple equals. So in quick summary, the double equals does the same thing when the types match, and you should know if the types match. It does it better when they don't match by doing the conversion for you and doing it more efficiently with less code and less overhead for people to look at. And it is a knowable set of safe coercions. It doesn't take a lot of time to learn, certainly not like it takes to learn TypeScript. And thirdly, the only time you should use triple equals is when you are in one of those unsafe cases or one of those places where you just don't know because you can't know the types. And that's my case for why we should be defaulting to double equals. In other words, I cannot understand how TypeScript missed the opportunity, because to me, this would have been like a golden marketing opportunity. TypeScript could have said, TypeScript makes the double equals operator rational and safe, right?
Yeah.
Why are TypeScript developers not using double equals everywhere? Because they know the types, they know they match, and it's perfectly safe, and they would save their time. Why are they all using? I don't understand it. So there's my argument. You can yell and throw virtual tomatoes at me if you want, but that's why I believe once you learn JavaScript, you can make rational thought. You can go through rational thought processes like that. And every member of your team can be taught that thought process. Even your brand new junior out of boot camp, they can be all taught those. So.
Well, thank you very much. I think that really sums up the problem that I have with the industry right now, the problem with JavaScript. And you and I are talking about this topic recently, I guess. The different takes of why learning, teaching, or using JavaScript sucks right now, or the ways it could be improved. And this, if we had this at the center, this proper thinking, scientific methodology, as I call it, argumentation, this rationale behind every decision, knowing why you do things the way you do them, I think it would be like improved infinitely, and all of our experiences would be much better. A lot of the problems that I see nowadays is just because people don't question and don't really know why they do certain things the way they do. It's like it's forced onto you, like you're going to use this now. Create React app is no more, you have to use Next. And fine, right? Like it was just the cool kid until 2 days ago, and now it's not. All right, I'm going to accept that. But as we start questioning, I think we reach a point of, okay, now I understand what I'm actually doing, and I start to form opinions, and I'm going to do this and not the other one. I myself have a lot of strong opinions. I expect everyone to have their strong opinions and a fair debate going on about all these topics. I think we're really losing a lot of energy in the industry by following the hype and what is popular, what is endorsed by companies, what people pick up, shiny new talks at conferences, shiny new website launches. dubious technologies with great website designs. It's tough.
I think there's two, if I could point out, two root causes of that, because I agree a lot. One root cause is that I think we, as a front end JavaScript, front end development community, are a bit overwhelmed with the pace of maturation of the broader ecosystem, the introduction of new tools and new techniques. Other languages have had these things for decades, and we're relatively new to the game. And I think a lot of us have felt a bit overwhelmed by how much of that came really quickly. And what that bred, among other things, is a sense of, from that sense of overwhelm, from that sense that drives a lot of people's imposter, signals to go off or whatever. From that sense, I think a lot of people have responded by saying, take away my choices, right? Just give me the one right way to do the thing. And if tomorrow there's a new right way, that's fine. I'll rewrite it. But I don't have the space in my head to juggle 14 different things and make all these complex decisions. Somebody just tell me, right? And it often is just one or two people at the top of the engineering decision chain who just edict it. And whether they do so from a point of understanding why they're doing it, or they did it because they read a blog or watched a conference talk, or it's just whatever came up in a Google search, right? Like, I don't know. But they make the decision, and that just flows down to many, many other people. So that's one reason why people are especially in our industry, I think, have this proclivity, is because we're just overwhelmed by it. We're like, I can't take all of these choices, and I don't want all these choices. The other root cause, and it's something that I've tried to work on in some of my work, trying to improve engineering culture beyond the lines of code that we write, just how we structure and how we run engineering teams. One big problem that I have is that there has been, I think, a myth propagated that the most effective teams are effectively monoculture teams. We talk a lot about mono repos versus microservices or whatever, but monoculture, meaning what we need to do to be an effective team is to get everybody into one box. Whatever that box is, everybody just conforms. And it breeds this idea that whatever opinions you have, whatever preferences you have, check them at the door when you come into work, because we have the one right way that this is done for us, because we need every single line of code to look like it was written by that one monoculture dev, rather than written by, a rich tapestry of lots of different engineers with different ways of doing it. So the idea is that that's the only way to be productive. It's the only way to manage a team, and it's the only way for the team to communicate and be productive, is if everybody's doing it all the same way, all the same code style, all the same tooling, all the same editor configuration, everything. That monoculture is cutting out most of the value of what it means to be an engineer. Most of what you are trained when you are an engineer is the creativity and problem solving that goes outside of whatever current box you're in to find the right answer. And when we are basically telling people, stop going out of the box because that's going to hurt our productivity, we are going to get these echo chambers in our engineering teams that are just going to produce the same churn of stuff. And it's really, somebody at the top will decide tomorrow, hey, we're switching from React to Vue, and they'll just flow, and then everybody will just kind of do it. And nobody's going to stop and ask, well, what if Vue's not the right thing? Maybe switching from React is right, but what if Vue's not? What if it should be Svelte or Quick or whatever? You're training people not to ask those questions and push on those things. So that's another reason why we're seeing this happen. And I think we need to go back to the drawing board in engineering culture and say, maybe what is the best code base is the one that is as I said, a rich tapestry that reflects all of the different various talents and skill levels of our engineers. Maybe that's actually a better code base, and it's a better way to run a team. And I just wish more people out there were willing to admit that maybe we got it wrong in trying to get everybody to conform to this one narrow thing.
Dictators and dictatorship. I think it never works. Nowhere. Also in languages, this is a rant that I always do about Python and and Ruby on Rails, how that like one person at the helm serves or does not serve the community and the languages. I agree. Freedom research is what propels us further. So why do we stop doing those things in terms of some arbitrary metrics of productivity? And if those people are so right, why is it changing all the time? Like, if you have absolute knowledge of what is best for you and your team in terms of productivity, writing code, whatever, why is it changing every couple of years? That doesn't seem to me, it's like it has a solid footing, a solid infrastructure. Those like thoughts, it's shifting. I mean, of course opinions can change and maybe you're going to have modifications, maybe it's going to go forward, but like fundamentally changing the base, not so sure that like you're starting from a position of research and science and really understanding the impacts of your original decisions. But anyway, before we move on to the topic of today, the future of learning software engineering, a recent development, or maybe relatively recent development for you, is that you're now together with Socket Supply as a principal engineer. And the web page is just, I don't know, crazy science. How would you describe it? Like what you're trying to do at Socket Supply?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I am thrilled and honored to be a principal engineer and also part of the senior technical management for Socket Supply. It's a tiny startup that has, as most startups, pretty big visions for how we're going to change the web. We're going to rewrite the web. So put simply, there are a lot of capabilities that should be available to web applications. There are APIs that we've heard about for years, like Bluetooth and Geo and networking and file systems and all of the, there are ostensibly web APIs that an application built using web technology should be able to access the full capabilities of the client device that it's running on, such that, you know, in theory, you should be able to write the same, you know, full fidelity app as a progressive web app that installs and have the same capabilities as if you'd written it in native code for that platform. But that isn't the reality, for a variety of reasons that we won't get into. It just isn't the reality. The web is a second-class citizen in the applications world. And I've lamented this for many years, as many others, many others have as well. And I guess in response to that, my choosing to join Socket was partly a pragmatic thing to say, I think if we go in a different direction, we can unstick the web from being the second-class citizen. So what Socket is doing is saying those capabilities should be available to your web applications. And because we can't rely upon the web APIs themselves, because they are limited, they're vendor locked, they're hobbled by certain vendors that aren't very good citizens, you know, things like that. Because of those problems, we're going to get around that by creating a native runtime for the platform that does expose those APIs. This is not a new idea. This goes back 15 plus years. I remember the early days of PhoneGap, which then became Cordova. There's been 100 other options since. So it's in some ways a re-evolution of some of those early ideas to say, let's give web apps the full capabilities of their devices. But Socket is doing, I think, some really important different things. So compared to some of the modern current alternatives like Tauri or Electron, here's a couple of things that are really true for Socket. First of all, the runtime that we create is not trying to provide an entire Node.js type application backend for you. We want you to write most of your application in your JavaScript layer, wrapped in your WebKit. That should be your code. We're simply augmenting it by providing some node-looking APIs for a few APIs, so file system, networking, Bluetooth. That leaves our runtime pretty thin. On mobile, it's like under 10 megabytes, and on desktop, it's like 1.5 megabytes. So it's a pretty tiny, focused runtime that we're providing, augmenting your experience with. your development experience with. That also means that we don't have any crazy like main process that on a desktop system could run, wild with just no security restraints
Yeah.
whatsoever. All of your code is in a web view, which we control with cores and all kinds of other policy stuff. So it should protect the apps from being able to do bad things on certain platforms. But I think the other big thing that excited me the most when I joined Socket is that we believe that by providing full networking capability to an app, we actually unlock a lot of potential that has been there and has been attempted many times and kind of not fully realized, which is to bring the peer-to-peer version of the web into existence. We've seen some of that with WebRTC, but in a lot of ways that never really fully lived up to its potential. And so by exposing a full networking stack and a peer-to-peer networking protocol that we've designed, we allow apps to now fully communicate directly with each other with no servers whatsoever. And what we believe the future of the web is a truly serverless web. No servers, no cloud, nothing. Just apps on client devices that know how to talk to each other, know how to transmit the information that each other need and only the information that they need, radically reducing how much information needs to go out, keeping all of that data local first to your device, which increases user privacy and control and gives users the identity and the autonomy that they really deserve and that they've had to give up because of the centralization of the web and the cloud. They've had to give all that up, and we want to bring that back to them. So we have this bold idea that if we really make peer-to-peer possible, the majority of apps can move in that direction, and there will probably still always be servers and cloud, but they will be not the default anymore. They will be for a few specific tasks. And for most of the web, you have this really full fidelity app-like experience without any middleman. You own your data, you decide where it goes. That's the big mission of Socket, and it's why I'm excited to be there.
I think this networking part really caught my attention. Like, for me, I know like there were a lot of other technologies that provided this cross-platform development and stuff, but this networking layer is one of a kind. And like, I think to me, it looks like that's the biggest thing that Socket will bring to the table. It feels to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's like the premises of Web3, decentralization of data and ownership of your own data, done right. Like without the hype, without the bullshit, but actually with great technology that can scale. Tried and tested methodology is just a different take, making it available, accessible to everyone to build apps with. This is what it feels to me, and I think that's why it's going to be really huge.
Let me share with you my characterization for this. So prior to joining Socket, which I did at the beginning of this year, I spent a while working at a Web3 company. A Web3 company that I believed really, I still believe, really has some very important things to offer the broader world. There's a lot in Web3 that I'm not excited about, but there are some really, I think, important things happening. And I was working for a company that I think was doing that. But I became convinced during that employment that Web3 is too far different from Web2 to fully come into realization. And that a lot of what was the problems of Web3 were because we weren't addressing that it was so foreign to the way people are used to building in our current Web2. And so I personally, this is just me, I'm not even speaking for Socket Supply, but I personally believe that what we're creating is Web 2.5, which is the necessary interim steps and evolutions, not only for technology, but most importantly for user behavior and user mindset. We need to go through that. And I don't think that's going to take 6 months or a year. I think it's going to take a decade or 2 decades, a while, for us to really remake the web into a different place where people do by default believe that they own what they create and that it doesn't belong to some server somewhere. And, a lot of those things. And as that evolution happens over the next many, many years, I think we'll get closer and closer to finding the good parts of Web3 and making those happen. But I chose to step a little bit earlier in the life cycle and work on what I call Web 2.5. it is not Web3. We don't have anything blockchain in any of what we're doing. But I think the principles that we are trying to espouse for the web are going to pave the way for the good parts of Web3 to happen. If they're ever going to happen, I think they're going to happen through something like this.
It's amazing. And I'm looking forward to more revelations. In fact, right now I'm building a desktop application. That's why I was like so much interested in Socket as well, because I hate
you should check us out.
Chromium runtime, like shipping that with an app. There was MacGap before, a similar technology, and I was very much into it because it was using Safari as the engine on Mac. That's why I was like very much into Socket, and then I came across this networking stack, and I was like, okay, this is true revolution here. This is like amazing piece of technology. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it in action, and more companies building decentralized applications in that regard. And I'm sure people in Germany will love it as well for its privacy aspects.
Exactly. I think the EU is probably the prime spot for this to really take off. So it's I mean, I think we're in for an exciting few years as this really starts to take hold.
Perfect. So good luck with that, and we'll be looking forward to your success at Socket Supply. Speaking of the future, maybe this is a nice segue to our actual topic about like the future of learning software engineering and JavaScript, maybe in particular. Now, as I told before, we are a school and we are trying to catch the times and like the trends in teaching. Just like you said, we adopt a journey-based methodology. Like we're training people to be like solo entrepreneurs with their code, so they can design their applications, write the code for it, ship it full stack. So ideally, they don't need anyone else, and it's like a story-based approach where they learn things at the right moment they need. So it's not like a dump of academic stuff that you don't know where you're going to use. But we first introduce the need for a piece of technology, and then introduce the solution. Now, AI is the big elephant in the room. It's going to affect everyone for sure. And we're trying to figure out how it's going to affect us. And I was a huge fan of Copilot. I'm using it daily whenever I write code. I love it. It kind of reads my mind. And I did something really dangerous in this last cohort 2 months ago. We first introduced GitHub code spaces. So ditch the local environment. Everyone works with a code space. We introduced Copilot. So all of the students from day one have Copilot in their environments. And I built an AI teaching assistant in Slack called Taiga. It's a teaching assistant that is kind of trained on our curriculum and can answer relentlessly, day and night, all the questions over and over again, a lot of examples. And so like it's already available right now. People can just add it to their Slacks. And of course, I don't know what's going to happen. On the surface, it looks like the students of this cohort are more productive. They write more code. They have a better understanding and command of all the stuff that we're teaching. But it feels like playing with fire. Do you really understand what you're doing when you're working with AI? Does the AI even understand you in the first place? What do you think of all of this thing?
Yeah, this is why I was thrilled to jump on this, because I definitely have both a lot of thoughts already formed and a whole bunch of space that is still reserved for the jury's still out. We're still seeing this play out. And I typically don't end up sharing a lot of opinions on things until after I've got a pretty well-formed opinion on them. But I keep getting asked these questions because people want to know. And so I have to caveat that my opinions on this are still shifting. They're still being formed. But I do have some experience in this area. So I spent about 6 months or so consulting with an earlier version of AI code assistance. Some people may know of a tool out there called Tab9.
Yep.
I worked with them for a while, and they were using GPT-2, so that'll tell you just how like old they were. But I'm kidding. This was not that long ago, but they were using GPT-2, and they trained it a bunch of code on top of the GPT-2 model, and they have this great plugin out there that does these like one or multi-line autocompletes. You start typing something and it suggests what is the rest of the line. There's this subtle difference between that and typing a code comment and asking it to just drop in all the code. And I'm a little bit more in favor of the autocomplete mindset, where you've started to type something concrete, versus the really GPT-ish, like here's basically a ChatGPT prompt in the form of a code comment. What do you got, right? But you know, there are both profound and subtle differences there, so that's probably not worth really getting wrapped too around the axle on. But I do think there are some issues there. One thing that I'm particularly concerned about with all of the current generation of our code suggestion, complete, whatever tools that we're seeing out there, and there are far too many to even keep track of. But Copilot you've brought up. One thing I'm concerned about is that when you have a tool suggest multiple lines of code, it's not that different than when you found multiple lines of code on a Stack Overflow post, and you grab those lines of code and you copy them into your code base.
Mm-hmm.
It is almost certain that you are going to keep some of those lines of code completely untouched, and you may have to tweak another set of those lines, right? So let's say you pull in 10 lines, whether it's from Stack Overflow or from an AI tool. You pull in 10 lines, and there are 2 lines that you need to make a tweak to. Maybe it's changing an ID or changing a condition or adding, but you make a couple of targeted changes in the middle of those 10 lines of code. One of my biggest concerns is that when you submit that code, when you commit it, when it's submitted for a pull request, code review, whatever, even though you only wrote 1 or 2, even though you only tweaked 1 or 2, and you may have even only thought about 1 or 2 lines of code, all 10 of those lines of code are your responsibility. And more importantly, they are the team's responsibility. This is actually the same argument that's been happening for 20 plus years of the web, that if you load a third-party library onto your page, you now own that code, even though you didn't write it. Because if their code does something bad on the page, your page broke, not their server, right? So it's the same idea. If I grab this 10 lines of code from Stack Overflow, or if I grab it from a code complete, I own all 10 lines of those code. But because it's such an enticing model to say, look how much I didn't have to write, it is training us to look at only the couple of most important parts of it, fix or change those, or maybe just accept them because we don't even really fully understand what it's doing, but it looks right and it was suggested by a tool, so it's probably right. And then we submit it. And here's the real problem. The code reviewer on the other side has no idea which of those 10 lines is in which bucket. They don't know which of those 10 lines you did actually think about and tweak and change and add or remove or whatever, versus the other lines that you just submitted as is. So when they're code reviewing, they don't have the full context. And I would say that what we need is actually those tools to start getting a lot smarter at what they tell us about what has been auto-generated versus what has been engineer edited. Because as a code reviewer, what I would want to do is spend way more time reviewing the code that you didn't look at than the code that you did. And I got to look at all of it. But if I'm dividing up my time, I'd spend 70% of my time on the code that you just submitted and didn't look at. Right. But we don't know that context. So that's a big problem, is that there is a big disconnect between we're having AI shove a bunch of code into the front end of this pipeline, but the tools on the back end, and there are some tools out there that are emerging that are helping with this, but I don't think they're solving this problem yet. Those need to get a lot smarter. We need to close the gap of feedback We also need to close the gap for the developer, by the way. So if that developer does change something about the code, that should feed back into the system and change the next suggestion. And right now it doesn't. Right now
Yeah.
that information is being lost largely. And that should not be lost, because that is actually super critical information. What I
Right.
saw that I needed to change is something the system really needs to know, so that they don't send the wrong thing to the next engineer. But anyway, we're not getting any of that information. But I will tell you that everything that I've just said about AI, you could throw out the window. You could probably figure out how to change. But there is one deeply troubling problem about this proposition that keeps me up at night, literally. And it is that the way our current generation of AI is working, this generative AI, the way that it works is effectively statistical prediction. If we feed it a whole bunch of data and then we give it some context somewhere in the middle of that data, it's going to start spitting out stuff that looks proximate to that prompt, right? And the further and further it gets from the prompt, the less and less those statistics hold. But hopefully it's not too far afield. That's the big hope and guess here, is that if I give it just enough context, it'll find just the right set of things to start generating probability wise from my prompt. But that does not equal understands your problem. It only equals got you somewhere in the vicinity of something that might be correct. And what's really missing here, and I kind of solidified my position on this when I did a thought experiment on social media a month or so back, and I was like thinking about creating, and this wasn't a fake thing. I meant it. I was like, I'm thinking about creating a trained AI model, ChatGPT sort of a thing,
Mhm.
that's like Ask Getify or whatever. And I trained
Yep.
it on all of my books and on all of my conference talks and on all of my podcasts that I've ever been on, everything that I've ever said, just train it on all of that, because I've got more than enough out there that we could
Yeah.
train a high quality model on just what I've said, right? And then I got to thinking, like, actually, a lot of my book material is already in ChatGPT, right? Because it's all been open source for a decade.
Yes.
So it's already in there. And so I've tried to go to those tools, and a variety of them, but I've tried to go to those tools and ask them questions like, literally, what would Kyle Simpson Getify say about how to do this in JavaScript? Which I know are things that I've said in my book. So I know that it's a high quality match probability wise.
Yeah.
And what it spits out is completely opposite of what I say. And that is troubling to me, because it's already been trained largely on what I've said, and it's still giving the opposite of what it should. And what I realized in the research is what we're missing is the adversarial training. We not only need to train these models on what they might want to say, we also have to train them. If we want this to be really useful in this mode, we need to train them on what not to say. And adversarial training, from what I can tell, is orders of magnitude harder to get the material for. It's much
Yeah.
harder to get the material that says Kyle would not say this than it is to get the material Kyle did say this. But to get a model that would even remotely start giving you answers as if it was me, we would have to produce all of that content where we went through all the other things that everybody else says about JavaScript that are contrary to me. And we would have to train the model. Kyle disagrees with that. And Kyle would say, no, that's not right because of this. And that is a body of work that greatly eclipses the body of work of what I've put out of what I do believe, right?
Yeah.
So I don't even know where we would get that data set from. I don't know how we would practically do it. But if we wanted to get even close to a tool that could give that kind of information, we're a long way away from that on the adversarial training aspect. And so what that means, if we broaden out from a Ask Getify tool, what that means is we don't know that what it's suggesting to you for JavaScript or React or Vue or whatever is correct. We just know that it looks something like something it's seen before. We don't know that it's not, like the React team would have to go and put out a whole bunch of adversarial training on don't do this with React. This is where bugs happen from React. Vue and Svelte. These teams would have a massive workload ahead of them if we want to get to the point where we can get some higher confidence in generative AI. So that to me is a fundamental problem, not a surface problem. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that's going to maybe be a deal breaker for this revolution of generative AI, is that we don't yet know how to produce the other data set and how to get the models constrained to not going afield and saying things that are totally not accurate. It's why you ask it factual stuff like, George Washington's birthday, and if you ask it 5 times, you'll get 4 times the correct answer, but a 5th time it'll come up with a totally wrong date.
Yep.
That should never happen, but it's because somewhere out there it saw somebody else named George Washington with a different birthday, and we didn't adversarially train that model to not answer that wrongly, right?
Yep. Wow. Amazing. A lot to unpack here. So one thing, by the way, we're over an hour. It's already like
I'm quite the talker, and I apologize to the audience for having to listen to me talk.
I'm very much enjoying the conversation right now. So maybe if you're fine with it, we could go on for a couple more minutes.
I'm fine with it. Let's keep going.
So as an educator, I have to tell all my students, like, please don't watch any videos especially on YouTube about like this thing, like this topic, because I don't know what you're watching and I cannot verify if it's correct or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big risk for me. Don't just read like random blog posts. If anything, please put your resources on Slack so that I can take a look and tell you whether they're good or bad. Now, also on Stack Overflow, right? A lot of solutions, like, beginners don't even really recognize whether an answer is relevant or not to their question, whether they could like properly phrase their questions in the first place. So they probably get like random results on Google. So I was dealing with that, and now I also have to deal with generative AI because it sounds so convincing, because it's like speaking to you directly, especially on Slack.
That's the problem, right? Is that it sounds far too convincing. It assertively says this is true in fact, and when you tell it, no, that's not true in fact, it's like, oh, I'm sorry, I messed up, let me try again. Like, it sounds way too authoritative. I actually think these interfaces need to change their responsive wording to say it's probably like this code, or something like that, because when it says here is how you do this, and already that it's literally impossible to do, but it is affirmatively telling you here's how to do it, like that, that wording around it is actually problematic.
So one way I'm trying to tackle this is I tell everyone, don't use it in a direct message. Only ask the AI, the chatbot, in a public channel so that I can see what answers it gives. And then I can also jump in and correct.
Collective intelligence. Many humans hopefully constrain the bot. I like it.
This is the way I could find we could make use of it, because it's very realistic, authoritative, and like it talks a lot as well. Like, no human could type that fast. Sometimes I feel I find myself in a conversation with a student and an AI going on, like the student asking a question, the AI is responding with something and it's wrong, and I'm typing why it's wrong, but the student already picks up and asks another question, and the AI answers yet another wrong answer, and now I have to fix that as well. I found myself a couple of times deleting the messages from the AI. Obviously, the AI in question, the one we built, is using GPT from OpenAI, of course. And in that regard, it gets certain things wrong. Its knowledge is cut off in 2021. Like, I don't even know what it would do with React right now. Like, so much has changed in the past 2 years. I don't know what it would like, if any of its suggestions would hold any value right now in terms of canonical React. But
There's
one,
lots of production code that is shipping every single minute of every single day that is coming from there. So I guess we'll see if stuff in the real world just starts breaking in mass. We'll see.
one thing that is for certain though is this is here and it's gonna stay.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons for why I wanted to build this bot in the first place is to be in on the race to tame it. And
Better to be in the game than sitting on the sidelines complaining. I agree.
and maybe we can, like, if we actively research on this, maybe we can find better ways of making use of it. So that's a discussion, like, how do we do it in a way that we don't tell our students not to use AI and kill their enthusiasm about something that's coming up, but use it responsibly, ethically, and responsibly, also factually. Like, how do you think it's going to affect your teachings and your trainings as well?
Right. So it has not yet made its way in anything other than joke form into any of the concrete stuff I've done. It's kind of it's made its way into like a conference talk, and I've mentioned it a few times as jokes in a workshop or something, but it has not made its way into my teaching realm. But to be responsive to your question, I have two concrete things that I think we should be doing educationally. Well, one is about the education process and one is about the technology process, but it will flow to how it's educated. To speak about the education, since that's the domain both of us are in, and it's the main reason why we're here in this call, I think you should lean into the positive and negative aspects of this AI. And so I've envisioned myself in a future version of teaching something. I don't know that I'll do this, but if I was ever going to have a course like you have done, you're kind of pioneering here, but if I was ever going to have a course where I embrace the idea as a first-class citizen, we're using this tool, everybody should use it, whatever, then what I would be doing is accepting the reality that I not only have to teach the coding, but I also have to teach the usage of the tool, because people will not by default know the correct way to use the tool. And so what I would do is have lots of sessions where what I did live on screen was say, all right, we want to do this. And I would type in the prompt in the code comment for what we wanted to do and let the bot spit out some code. And then I would talk everybody through my analysis of everything that came out. And I'd say, well, this came out correct, but this is totally wrong. This won't work, and here's why. And we jump over and see why that was totally wrong. And here's this line, and analyze this line, and whatever. And I'd make all the changes to it. And I would just keep doing that over and over and over again in a course, showing them not only the positive usage of it, like, hey, this spit out a thing and it was correct, but more importantly, doing the adversarial thing for them, right? Show them the adversarial process. Because if the model has not done the adversarial process, then we have to artificially do that for them. That is how humans learn, right? We get knowledge when we sit in a classroom and they teach us something. And the whole rest of our life is a regurgitation of that matched with the adversarial learning of that's not how that works in the real world, right? You cannot expect that if all we do is do the generative part and all we do is teach somebody once how to do 2 + 2, that for the rest of their life, they'll understand all addition in all contexts. That's not how it works for humans. And it's not how it's going to work with these tools. The rest of your life, the rest of your software development career is the adversarial learning process where you start with what it said and learn how that actually applies and what does and does not fit with your actual context. And so we have to replicate that for them. We have to do it in a class, and we have to teach them, if you're going to use one of these tools, this is how you have to do it. And I think one of the offshoots of that, I mean, I hope that will drive up some of the quality. I think like what you said about doing it in public so that other people can see and maybe flag it if it's like, hey, no, actually that's BS, that's not true. Like, yeah, I hope that's happens. Community is good, and we should be developing as a community rather than as islands. So I'm, as a human centric person, I'm all in favor of that relational and community oriented approach. But we're going to have to walk them through the good and the bad. And the bad is maybe more important than the good. We're going to have to walk them through it, because we cannot assume that everybody will just naturally know how to interact with these tools. In fact, we should assume the opposite. We should assume that everybody's going to do it wrong until we've got 10 or 20 years under our belt of learning how to interact in this new way. So we've got to teach them that. And we've got to model that behavior for them, and model that they not only need to do it here in class, but going forward in your jobs, wherever you land, if you use one of these tools, here's what you got to do. And I think what we may see, hopefully it drives with the quality, but I think we may see, possibly, this is just a prediction, we may see that people start to realize that this is not actually going to be faster for coding, but it might actually be slower for the software engineering process if you do the full thing. We may start to see people say, you know, I use it in a couple of places when I really need help with it, but like most of the time I just write the code myself, because the full auditing and adversarial learning process applied to every single code suggestion probably won't scale. And until we get models that have been better adversarially trained, until we get second and third and fourth generation models where we are training them on the code that we first produced from the first model and then was edited, and then we're training it only on that code and maybe a third and a fourth generation, until we get to that point and we have models like that, we're going to have to be doing it. And I think people are going to see that that is, if they do that responsibly, is going to take a lot more time and effort to do. The good news is people are going to learn a lot better. So as an educator, I'm happy about that, right? If people do that responsibly, that will lead to a very rich learning experience. So I think that's good. So that was the number one. That's the first thing. The second thing, not directly affecting education, but will indirectly significantly affect it. I actually think that one of the problems here is that we are trying to reverse engineer these models from a highly distilled expression of what a programming language or tool is, based on what somebody has written about it, like in a blog post, and publish it up on the web. That is not the way these models really should be trained. And so one of the things I think we need to do, certainly for existing languages, but I'm going to say this actually for the next languages that get designed, those language designers need to be leaning into the idea that they should be creating those models, both the positive and adversarial models, as they design the language. Like literally from the beginning, you should be thinking about, how will I make this model understand this language? Not, how will I make this model understand all of human discourse that may include code snippets around it? I need the model to actually understand what is good and bad about language X, right? And I happen to be designing a new programming language myself, and I am going to eat my own dog food here, and I am going to start trying to, before I ever roll out, you know, a full set of tools around this language, I'm going to take the time to build a model and test it and see, does it spit out the kind of code that I think it should be spitting out, before I ever put any of that out. So I think that's something that's going to help, is if we get a new generation of tools which were designed specifically to be trainable. We need to design the language and the documentation to be ingestible by these learning models, rather than assuming that it's good enough to just ingest whatever's on random blogs out there on the internet.
It's tough. It's, I guess, like, how are we going to get to that state? Because it's already tough that we as humans have like a lot of different opinions on languages, frameworks. And now there's another thing, like this AI already speaking of it's almost like its own mind about these things. Like, and it speaks to everyone. I guess like the problem here is when we talk to one another, it's like two people and that conversation is there, or like in a classroom. You are the teacher, there are students, that conversation is there. And your opinions are valid for that classroom or for that conversation. Now, this thing is massive at scale. Millions of users are using it, and it has one single mind or many, and talking to all these people at the same time. So that's a challenge that I'm having. Like it's already out there. Um, it is giving
I
everything
think to
responses.
whatever extent we have the ability, we need to ensure that it is not one single AI, but rather that we are creating millions and millions of different models for different purposes, different
Mhm.
consumption modes. We should not be thinking, oh, yeah, all this is going to feed into the one big giant AI that Microsoft or Google runs and they charge us $9.99 a month for. I'm glad that those places are out there, and I'm glad they exist, and they are certainly rapidly advancing this. But the future of this, if it's going to be successful and integrate with the human race and help us rather than replace us, if this is an augmentation of our lives and of our careers and of our work, it's going to have to be that it's as easy to get a model for my team, for what we're doing, for the domain that we're working on, as it is for me to tweak the outcome of the Create React app. And
Mhm.
if it's not, if it's like one size fits all, this, the ultimate in monoculture around coding is that there's one code suggestion engine and everybody just does whatever it says, and nobody like that. That's not going to work, right? And if that's what happens, that really will replace us as developers. But if what happens is that we create thousands or millions of these different models for these different,
Mhm.
made in these different ways, trained on these different resources, and used in these different ways, then I think we will stay at the center of that narrative, and the tools really will be helping us do our jobs better.
One thing that I started doing in this regard is, or that I noticed, is that I'm now not that much concerned about teaching my students the syntax of whatever we're working on, but rather evaluation of code. Like what happens generally is like the Copilot writes the code, and then I, just like you said, I teach them this is how you evaluate code, almost like teaching them code reviews.
Mm. Yep.
And I was talking to another friend a couple of days ago, and he said, like, we're almost now training people to become senior engineers right out of the box without
Yeah.
ever becoming juniors.
Yeah.
And now they're trained more on understanding the code, like running it in their minds, seeing what works or not. And maybe like maybe it's gonna end up learning that language or that environment, that framework better because they learn how to criticize it. I think that's where most of the value is in my teaching anyway, not like the practical
Mm.
usage of a tool you can find there like anywhere online, but rather why you would do that and how you would do that and why you would pick this approach over the other one. um, so I
I think
see.
I think you're right that the we are not intentionally, but unintentionally, the bar has been significantly raised. The gap between I don't know how to program and I know enough about programming that I could even remotely hope to get hired as the most junior beginner of engineers. That gap is significantly widened over the last few years, and it is widening at a jaw-dropping pace. That concerns me for the health of our industry, that we are making it harder and harder for people to get in, where it might have been a few months of work in a boot camp now. It might now, or a few years ago, it might now be more realistic that you need to spend about a year
Mm.
on the process of learning to be a software developer before you can really realistically expect to get your first paycheck in this job. Um, all of the whole boot camp world, which you're in, was designed to go from the 4-year university degree
Yep.
down to a few weeks or months. And
Yep.
what's happening in the industry is that we're now expanding back in the other direction, where it's going to take more and more time. I think it's important to articulate, what is it that we want for these people? Like, we have to have a mission for it. And there's a lot of different things that we could talk about. Like, we want people with a growth mindset that believe that wherever they're at, they can improve that. We want people to be, human focused, others focused, to have empathy. There's a lot of things that we could talk about that we want, but I'll focus on one thing that we should want. And I think we don't do enough job training on. And this is going to be risky, because I have shared ideas like this in the past in ways that really upset people. So just fair warning.
Go ahead.
I'm treading onto a dangerous limb here, but I'm going to do it on purpose. One of the things that I think characterizes somebody who is a more senior engineer, somebody who's been around longer, is somebody who's made a lot of messes and learned how to clean up those messes, right? And I don't think we do enough of a job of training incoming people, learning in code schools, new hires on teams, what it looks like to make a mess and what it looks like to clean up a mess. And so one of the things that I think we're going to need to get better at over that period of time, whether you have a 3-month boot camp or a 12-month boot camp or a 24-month boot camp, is we're going to have to accelerate the process by which somebody who's never been a software developer experiences for themselves, alongside somebody who's more senior to them, guiding them along the way. They need to see how these messes get created, the
Yes.
decisions that we make that lead to those messes getting created, and more importantly, the decisions and the balances and the choices that we make about how to clean them up. Because that's a reality. This job is a messy job. We make messes all over the place. And only the most senior people are the people that have really realized there's no such thing as I don't make messes. There is such a thing as I kind of know how to avoid some of the common messes, but I still make messes all the time. So there's no such thing as I don't make messes. I just gotten better at recognizing an early mess and cleaning it up quickly, rather than, the whole floor is flooded, right? So my wisdom that I'd impart to you as an educator, and just more broadly to the audience, is we need to focus on that. When we're bringing people into teams, when we're teaching people things, we need to show them that messes are a reality, that everybody makes them, even the most senior people in the team, and that everybody has the responsibility of mess cleaner upper. I'm deliberately avoiding the word for mess cleaner upper, but everybody needs to learn that, because that is, to me, a reality of being a software engineer.
100% agree. One thing that I keep telling people is that you have to live long enough to maintain the code that you wrote. Like, maintain it for a year or two, and then you're really going to understand like all of the mess that you have created, and you're tasked with cleaning it up, just like you said. Then you can talk about like being a senior engineer. If you jump from company to company, or like do freelance projects here and there for a couple of months, or do a couple of projects, MVPs, and give it away, and never maintain what you have created in the first place, it's very limiting in terms of your experience, your understanding of what engineering really looks like, because you never have to deal with the consequences of your creation. And it really trains you when you see, when you're at the same company for like 2-3 years, that whatever you created in the first place moved on to a different team now. They're trying to maintain it. And like, you're like, that's a very genuine way of handling the code that I wrote. I never thought one could misinterpret it that much. And
Right.
now let me help you out. Like, that is when you really learn, I think, how to avoid those messes early on. And until you do that, like, you're still a junior engineer that still needs to learn a lot more. Like, the fact that you can write code that works does not really mean much in that regard, because this is a social activity. It's a team sport. Will your team be able to maintain it? Will they understand it? Will you understand it in 6 months' time?
Yep.
How will you feel when you look at that code in a situation where you have a bug in production that's like losing you millions in minutes, and you have to deal with your own code? How will that make you feel? Like those kind of things, those experiences. I don't know how we're going to simulate those. That's where
Well,
the real learning
if I
is.
was educating right now, if I was in the classroom educating, the thing I'd be doing is mixing up empty file greenfield, I need you to build the following, with here's an existing code base that sucks. It does a thing well, all the tests pass, but the code base is terrible. And by the way, we've received a bug report and there's something wrong with it. And we're going to go through this code base together and look at all the messes, look at all of the to-do comments that are still in there 3 years later, look at all of the like poorly named variables and weirdly organized functions. And we're just, we're going to jump into the mess together. And we're going to find that bug, and then we're going to see how difficult it is to fix that while not breaking something else, right? That's the reality. And we're going to have to create those scenarios and walk them through that, because they will experience that once they get on the job. We need to be teaching them that. And by the same token, if I were interviewing people, I may be in the position to interview people in the future for my startup. We're small now, but we hope to grow and hope to hire. If I were interviewing people, I'd be doing the same thing. I would be giving them code that works but sucks, and walking through, how do you react to that? What do you do? How do you understand it? What questions do you ask? How do you fix it? How do you triage when I give you a bug report against that code? Like that is the real stuff of being a software engineer. And we don't educate it and we don't interview for it. And it shouldn't be a surprise that if we don't educate and we don't interview for it, we get this mismatch where people have to learn those lessons the hard way. We need to front load that learning, get it into the education process, get it into the interview process, so that you're already well versed in what the messes are and how to spot them and how to clean them before you've ever, been on the job your first day, if you will.
I have so many things to say about this.
Maybe we should schedule a follow-up of these sessions. We can pick up 2.0 of this conversation, and we can dive into even more of those thoughts. But
I would definitely love to. And like, I know, like, before the stream, we also like lined up a lot of different topics. I really want to pick your brain on whatever's happening right now in the JavaScript world. Like, are we going back to 2003 and building web pages with PHP all over again, where we have queries in our view logic, in our PHP code, right?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff, that like controversial things, and I know that you also have a lot of opinions on those things. Should we like maybe briefly touch upon that topic before we wrap up? And let's definitely do it again. Yes.
Yeah, I will summarize my response to the world of the umbrella world of server components, right? And I don't mean that only for the React world, but that certainly is a big part of it. But this concept that we're swinging the pendulum back to, got to write all of this stuff, my view logic stuff in the server and run it and somehow have that magically make its way over the wire or whatever. Been there, done that more than once. I've been around the sun, seen that happen. And my response, this is me speaking, is if we just got rid of the servers, we would get rid of a lot of these problems. And that's why I'm working at Socket. I don't think that there should be a distinction between the client and the server for us to have all of these problems that we need to figure out over the wire. If the app was on the system, most of those problems would go away. Most of the web performance optimization industry, core web vitals, and all of that other stuff becomes completely unnecessary if we simply remake the web back to this model of local first apps that are on devices. The concept that we go to websites, like, here's my little spiel in this, like the concept that we go to a website that is a web app, like it's a Gmail or something like that. We go to that, and every single time we visit it, we reinstall the app. The web has famously been sold as a zero install experience. That's a total lie. That's a complete lie. The web is an install every visit experience. And if somebody said that all of the native apps on your phone, that every single time you open up Spotify or whatever other apps that Netflix or whatever, every single time you open it up, it's got to re-download itself over and over and over again, people would laugh at that as absurd. And yet that is what we've accepted as the status quo for the web. That's what's wrong, right? That's what's driving. That's the real core problem that's driving all of this desire to do server components and all this other stuff, is because we created the problem of the wire. And if we just got rid of the wire, most of that problem would go away. So that's an overly simplified summary of my response to what's happening with server components these days.
I guess it really ties well to your work at Sucker Supply, right?
Yes, very much so.
Amazing. It's a great connection. Yeah, like been there, done that is something I feel for a very long time. And I guess people who wrote code in the 80s would look.
They probably look at
us.
me like, oh God, he's saying the same thing I said in the 70s and 80s. Yep. We just keep repeating the same old themes over and over again.
Okay, so before we wrap up, one last thing. I feel like we're not learning enough from the past. Like there's so much out there that we could just read and learn, so much experience out there when it comes to app development or engineering. We're missing out on that. Like we're not reading enough, we're not learning enough. We're trying to reinvent the wheel all the time. This is something that I feel, especially recently with all the developments in the JavaScript world. Do you share a similar sentiment, or what's your take on past and learning from the past?
I might ruffle a few feathers here, but I'm going to push back on it and say that I don't think that that's our problem. I know the quip, if we don't learn from the past, we're doomed to, if we don't learn from the failures of the past, we're doomed to repeat them. It's true. I'm not going to disagree with that. But, we live in a dynamic and evolving world. And the way we thought about web development in the early 2000s doesn't apply now. Technology is different and people are different. And people have different expectations of software than they did in 2000. And so there are some things for us to learn from the mistakes of the 2000s or the mistakes of the 90s or the 80s or the 70s. But the further you go past that, the less and less of those lessons are even still applicable today. I would say our real problem is not that we're not learning from the past. We're not learning the current. We're just plowing forward to the next thing. If we were more present in the present, if we were more analytical of the present, if we were more willing to challenge our existing status quos and ask, why is it that we are doing this right now? What, just because we've always done it that way is not a good enough answer. Why is it that we're doing that? If we as an industry embraced a much more all-encompassing self-analysis and self-awareness of our present, of our current realities, the good and the bad, then I think we would do a better job of laying out what comes next a year or 2 or 3 from now. I think what's really happening is that those things are largely happening by accident. They're happening because of some accidental convergence of the right person or the right company had the right set of marketing at the right time to grab the right amount of market share at just the right moment. And the industry shifted in that direction. And there was nobody other than maybe a few people that wanted that to be the direction. There was not a lot of people that sat around and said, does that make sense for us to do that? Right? We just ended up there. And then once we got there, the same thing repeats itself over and over again. And so if we took a little bit more time to think about where we're at and where we'd like to be, the old quote from years and years ago, the Alan Kay quote. Those of you who don't know Alan Kay, one of the godfathers of programming, invented small talk among other things. But he said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. That's one of those famous quotes that people have probably, some of you have probably heard. I have a different take on that quote than most people's interpretation of it. Many people take that quote as an inspirational quote that, hey, if I go invent something, I have the ability to make it into be the future. I mean, that's true. And actually, that's the reason why most of us are software developers, because it's really intoxicating and fun to have the power in our hands at our fingertips to create new. Out of nothing, we create new. And that is a fun and exciting field. And it's probably one of the biggest drivers of why people get into this industry. But I think the more important interpretation of Kay's quote is that whatever future happens, it's because we invented it. So when the bad stuff happens, it's because somebody didn't sit down and think about that first. Somebody didn't ask those questions, or somebody wasn't listened to when they asked those questions. And so whatever we end up with AI, whatever we end up with education, whatever we end up doing as our job with our fingers on the keyboards 3 and 5 and 10 years from now, that's going to be an invented future that somebody somewhere, some set of somebody's and decisions happen to make that occur. And I think, more often than not, it's like train tracks that are going parallel for a while and then they start to diverge. For a while, you can't tell that the trains are getting further apart, right? They're running mostly in parallel and everything seems fine. And then you might take a nap and wake up and then realize, I don't even see the other train anymore, right? Because little by little, there was some kind of, this is what's happening, is that we're diverging and taking these turns in little increments and not realizing until much later, hey, well, I'm on a very different path than what I wanted to be on. So I think we need to have more of that thinking right now. We have the responsibility right now to be figuring out what we're doing well and what we're not doing well, and making sure that 2 and 5 and 10 years from now, we're in a better place rather than a different and worse place. And I there are a few people that are out there that are inventing cool stuff, but I don't think that inventing cool stuff is what we need right now. That's I don't get all that excited and interested in, I invented a new cool thing. What I really get interested in is when somebody looks at what we've been doing over the most recent snapshot of time and plots out a better path for us. That's what I get interested in.
How do we get there? Two things. We cannot even agree on double equals versus triple equals with the industry, even on that, which one is better. And another deeper thing that I like, now that you mentioned all of these, inventing stuff and looking at the current and learning from the current of what we have, right? Take Tailwind. They released an article when they first published the library about why current way of writing CSS sucks and why Tailwind is better. It's a very long article. It has a lot of arguments in it. It tells that semantic CSS and everything just sucks. Atomic CSS and building CSS inside HTML is the way to go forward. They drew a conclusion following a scientific or seemingly scientific process of reasoning, argumentation, and they have their mind set on an approach like Tailwind. Now, I actually don't know your take on it. I personally am not a huge fan, but a group of people are following that trend. Now, does it mean they learned from whatever we are doing right now, the past, the today? And because I think we're going to lose in the end, and this is going to cause us a lot of engineering pain in the future, 5 years from now, maybe even CoffeeScript and all the mess it left behind, maybe even worse. I don't know how to deal with this. Because arguing doesn't make.
I am not versed enough in CSS frameworks. I barely know JavaScript, so I'm not versed enough in CSS to talk very articulately about why Tailwind is great or why Tailwind sucks. I will say, I know these technologies. I know how some of them have evolved and what they're purporting to do. And I will say that many of these technologies that come along and become very popular and, create a gravity unto themselves that draws in a certain segment of our industry, many of the times what they are doing is trying to create a one size fits all solution. And what they're trying to really pitch as a narrative is that all of the other variations that don't fit into that are not, well, I don't want to say that they're bad, but that those variations are a problem rather
Yeah.
than something for them to address. Like, you just shouldn't be doing that or whatever. So I guess I would characterize it as a somewhat more of a short-sighted perspective in the inventor's eyes, which is, I'm going to invent the one true way to do it.
Yeah.
And I'll contrast that with why I'm at Socket, because I don't look at Socket as providing one singular solution, but as pointing to a whole family and class of different solutions that should be the future. We have to create something so that we can prove that it works, but I think there will be many others that will come along in similar paths and do things differently, and that would actually be a win to me, as
Yeah.
opposed to, oh no, we've got to get everybody doing nothing but Socket all day long. Like that, Socket's not big enough for the future of the web. We are big enough to start laying down some foundational steps, and that's why I joined. But we can't be the one size fits all for the future web any more than Tailwind or React or Vue or any of these others can be. And so I guess I would say that I tend to bristle when I see the marketing and the narrative around something as the new one right, all encompassing silver bullet solution for everything. You want to get me interested? Make a web page where you show a framework and the whole front web page is all the apps that I should not build with that framework. Show me how you've thought. This is Chesterton's fence. If you don't know that principle, go Google it. Chesterton's fence. Why do I need to tear something down? I need to be able to explain why it was built first. So if you want to tell me that you've got the new way of doing it, you don't need to just tell me all the new things that you think, look how I can do this in one line or whatever, like most of the marketing does. You need to tell me all the things that your thing won't do. And if we have more time on here, I could sit here and tell you the things that I think Socket can't or won't do, because I think that's responsible engineering to understand the bigger context. And that's what I meant when I said we need people asking really what's happening and plotting out better paths. Part of that plotting is saying there is no one next step that we all take. There's a family, a class of steps that we all need to be taking. And I don't see that from the creators of these various JavaScript and CSS and server-side framework. Most of them are really just trying to get they're trying to get as much gravity as they can to their one solution. Yeah. And that, I think, can be troublesome for the future.
I think, yeah, you're so right, and that's a great way to put it. Like, what can I not do with this? What should I not do with this technology? What should I not build with Socket?
Well, I knew I was teeing myself up for that. I don't have enough time to get into all of it, but I will say that the concept of making the cloud optional, which is one of our biggest claims, does not mean there won't be any cloud. It does mean that the majority of what you're doing in the cloud, you don't have to do there, but that's only the majority. So there are things that you will never want to fully move onto peer devices. So for example, large video file distributions, that's a terrible thing to try to stream over a peer-to-peer network. You should still have a giant CDN in a cloud with edge CDN, for that kind of usage. Probably you shouldn't do large compute there are people that are actually trying to do
Yep.
distributed machine learning compute, and some of them are even looking at maybe trying to use sockets capabilities to do that. I don't know if that's going to succeed or not. I think you might still buy specialized hardware and stick it in a data center somewhere, a cloud somewhere, to do those kinds of things. And not all apps are going to translate well to peer. Some apps are going to be a little bit harder to do in a peer-to-peer model. Some of those apps are, maybe controversially, maybe those are just apps that shouldn't exist.
Okay.
I would say if it is hard to imagine building an app where the user owns their data local first, then maybe you should be asking, should I just not create that app? Because maybe it shouldn't exist. But there are definitely going to be things that are going to be harder to do in that model than they are to do in the central. That's why the centralized model, grew up. So that's my answer in a very quick summary. I could speak for hours about it, but in a quick summary, Socket and Socket's view of the future of the web is not an all-encompassing one, but it's one that I think a large majority of the web could and should move to.
Amazing. Perfect. Well, I guess I couldn't be happier. Thank you for taking this time. We agreed on an hour, and now we're like 2 hours.
Yeah,
and
this was
looks
fun.
Like we could go on forever. So maybe we're gonna do this again. It was really nice having you here and hearing your thoughts, and thank you for sharing your wisdom. Like our audience in chat put like really strong, enlightening words, and thank you so much for being here and joining us today, Kyle.
I've loved every minute of it, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you. All right, folks, we got our word. So let's see each other in the second part, in the second series. And until then, take care and have a great night, day, wherever you are. Bye.